The story of the Second World War does not truly begin in 1939 with the roar of tanks crossing Poland's borders, but rather in the smoldering ruins of 1918, when the First World War came to an end. The armistice signed in November of that year silenced the guns on the Western Front, but it did not heal the wounds carved into nations and hearts alike. Germany, once proud and ambitious, lay broken. Its soldiers returned not as victors, but as weary men carrying defeat on their shoulders. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 inside the magnificent palace halls of France, was presented as a peace settlement, yet it was written with the ink of vengeance. For the victors, it was justice; for Germany, it was humiliation. The treaty stripped away territory, reducing Germany's land and slicing its borders. It took away its colonies abroad, silenced its military might, and imposed reparations so vast they seemed impossible to repay. To add insult to injury, Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, branding a nation of millions with shame. In the early 1920s, these terms strangled the German economy. Families who once lived modestly now found themselves in despair. Inflation surged beyond comprehension. The German mark became so worthless that people carted wheelbarrows of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. Old photographs show children playing with stacks of paper money as if it were a toy, because it had no real value anymore. Farmers refused to sell their crops for paper that bought them nothing, so hunger spread across the cities. Ordinary men and women asked bitterly, "How long will we suffer for the sins of war?" The bitterness seeped deep, creating an anger that would later be harnessed by dangerous voices. Yet Germany was not alone in its suffering. The entire continent of Europe was staggering. France, though victorious, was scarred by destruction along its northern fields, where trenches had chewed up farmland and villages. Britain had lost a generation of young men, its cemeteries filled with endless rows of white crosses. The League of Nations was formed as a beacon of hope, a global organization meant to ensure that no war like the Great War could ever happen again. But it was an institution born weak. It lacked the authority to enforce decisions, and some of the most powerful nations, including the United States, chose not to commit themselves to it. Without teeth, the League was more a symbol than a shield. In this fragile post-war world, people longed for stability. But instead, instability deepened. By 1929, disaster struck again. The Wall Street crash in America spread across oceans like a plague. The Great Depression choked economies worldwide. Banks failed, factories closed, and millions were cast into unemployment. In Germany, already weakened, the depression was catastrophic. Families who had managed to survive the years of inflation now lost everything once more. Hunger returned, homelessness grew, and desperation filled the air. Men wandered the streets seeking work that did not exist. Mothers stood in breadlines with children clinging to their skirts. The political atmosphere grew poisonous. Extremist voices began to rise above the rest, promising salvation in exchange for loyalty. It was in this climate that Adolf Hitler emerged as a figure of terrifying charisma. A former soldier who had fought in the trenches of the First World War, he had felt the sting of defeat and humiliation personally. To the disillusioned masses, he spoke not only with anger but with vision. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles, the weak leaders of the Weimar Republic, and groups within society he painted. By the mid-1930s, Europe had already begun its slow march toward catastrophe, though many of its leaders refused to recognize the danger. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, was no longer hiding its ambitions. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was still a bitter memory, yet Hitler openly tore through its restrictions with boldness. In 1935, he announced the reintroduction of conscription and the rebuilding of the German Air Force and Navy. These actions directly violated the treaty, yet the world's response was timid. Britain and France, still haunted by the slaughter of the First World War, hesitated to confront him. Many believed that perhaps Germany deserved some leeway, that the treaty had been too harsh. Others hoped that if they gave Hitler small victories, he might be satisfied and peace might be preserved. This policy came to be known as appeasement. But appeasement only emboldened him. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that, under Versailles, was supposed to remain demilitarized. Hitler later admitted that had France resisted with force, he would have withdrawn. The German military was still too weak to fight a major war. Yet no one stopped him. The gamble paid off, and Hitler realized that boldness would not be punished but rewarded. Each move he made without consequence fed his confidence in his people's belief in his vision of a stronger Reich. Elsewhere, the world witnessed similar acts of aggression. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations left in Africa. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but its sanctions were weak and ineffective. The Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, pleaded before the League for help, warning that if aggression was allowed to go unpunished, no small nation would be safe. His words were powerful but ignored. The League, once envisioned as the guardian of peace, had revealed itself as powerless. Farther east, Japan expanded its empire. In 1931 it had seized Manchuria, establishing a puppet state called Manchukuo. In 1937, Japanese forces launched a full-scale invasion of China. The atrocities committed, most notoriously the massacre at Nanjing, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, shocked the world, but again, little was done. The aggressors had learned a dangerous truth: international outrage meant nothing if it was not backed by action. Hitler watched and learned. If Japan and Italy could expand with impunity, why not Germany? In March 1938, he turned his attention to Austria, his birthplace. He demanded unification of Austria with Germany in what he called the Anschluss. Austrian leaders resisted, but with Nazi supporters stirring unrest inside the country, Hitler threatened invasion. British and French leaders protested, but again, no one acted. German troops crossed the border, greeted by cheering crowds in Vienna. Austria was absorbed into the Reich without a shot being fired. Hitler had secured his first major expansion, and the world had done nothing to stop him. Next came Czechoslovakia. In the western border region of the Sudetenland lived a large German-speaking population. Hitler claimed these people were oppressed and that the land rightfully belonged to Germany. Czechoslovakia prepared to defend itself, but Hitler escalated his demands. Europe once more stood on the brink of war. In September 1938, leaders gathered in Munich to negotiate. There, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid conflict, agreed to Hitler's demands. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany without Czechoslovakia's consent. Chamberlain returned to London declaring that the agreement had secured peace for our time. Crowds cheered him, believing that war had been avoided. But the peace was an illusion. Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, German troops invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his promises at Munich had been lies. For Britain and France, the reality could no longer be ignored. Hitler's ambitions were not limited to uniting German-speaking peoples, he sought domination. Yet even then, many in Britain and France hoped that he might stop short of plunging Europe into another great conflict. The final straw was Poland. Hitler's eyes turned eastward, demanding the return of Danzig, a city under League control, and access through the Polish corridor, territory that had separated Germany from East Prussia since Versailles. This time, Britain and France issued firm guarantees: if Germany attacked Poland, they would declare war. Hitler, however, was undeterred. In August 1939, he made a move that stunned the world. He signed a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. This Nazi-Soviet pact shocked many, for fascists and communists were bitter ideological enemies. But behind closed doors, the pact included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland was to be carved up, with the Soviet Union taking the East and Germany the West. For Hitler, the pact removed the fear of a two-front war, giving him the green light to strike. On September 1, 1939, German forces unleashed their Blitzkrieg, lightning war, against Poland. Waves of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers swept across the country with terrifying speed. Within days, Polish defenses were collapsing. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its side of the pact. Poland was crushed between two giants. The world's worst fears had come true. Britain and France, true to their word, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Crowds gathered in silence as Prime Minister Chamberlain spoke solemnly on the radio, announcing that Britain was at war once more. France followed quickly. Yet for all their declarations, neither Britain nor France could save Poland, which was swiftly conquered. The Second World War had begun, born out of years of appeasement, aggression, and the failure of nations to confront tyranny when it might still have been contained. The road to war had been paved step by step, with each unchecked act of aggression making the next more inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles had planted bitterness, the Great Depression had fueled desperation, and weak international responses had encouraged dictators to believe they could act without consequence. When the storm finally broke in September 1939, it was not sudden but the result of years of neglect, miscalculation, and willful blindness. The world had hoped to avoid another war, but in doing so, it had allowed one far greater to unfold.